Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful event. My name is Christopher Miller. I am the Senior Director of Education and Community Engagement here at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. March is Women's History Month. We celebrate Women's History Month to remind ourselves of the accomplishments of women throughout the years to our culture and our society. But please know the legacy and brilliance of women cannot be contained within just 31 days of March. It's a part of the everyday reality of the American narrative. And particularly, Black women have played a remarkable role in the struggle for equity, democracy, and justice. From Mariah Stewart to Ida B. Wells to Stacey Abrams, Black women have been inherently valuable in the mosaic of struggles, of social struggles, as well as victories. We continue to do our Women's History Month programming in honor of those forebears that came before us, our foremothers, as we like to call them, but also for women that have been impactful for us as a museum, or whether that would be a Miss Jackie Wallace, who we unfortunately lost a few years back, as well as the countless number of staff and volunteers. Wanting to give a special shout out to Miss Bernita Britton, who's been an outstanding, remarkable volunteer for our museum. She's always been engaged with Women's History Month program as well as our youth initiatives. And so we wanted to give a special acknowledgement to her. And so you didn't come here to hear me speak. And so I'm going to pass it off to my colleague and friend, Katie Bramall, who is our Director of Museum Experience, to introduce our outstanding panel and get this discussion started. Thank you for joining us here today.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Chris, for that introduction. So I don't want to waste any time. I want to definitely get us started by introducing our panelists for tonight's discussion. Starting off, we have Dr. Carolette Norwood. She is the Associate Professor and Assistant Department Head in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Cincinnati. She also directs the Social Justice Program at UC and leads a funded study on reproductive justice and Black women in Cincinnati for the Ohio Policy Evaluation Network and a Black Women in Economic Mobility in Cincinnati study for Greater Cincinnati Women's Fund. Her research and teaching interests include U.S. and comparative Black feminism and how violence informs reproductive and sexual health and justice at the intersection of gender, race, sexuality, place, and space. Welcome to tonight's discussion, Dr. Norwood. Next on our panel discussion, we have Dr. Djanna Hill. She is a chairperson of the Department of Community and Social Justice Studies and professor of teacher education at William Paterson University. Her work convenes as the intersection of science education, teacher preparation, and social justice. Professor Hill's latest co-authored book, Star Teachers of Children in Poverty, brings an awareness of teacher dispositions and educational politics to the forefront when preparing teachers for diverse classrooms. Dr. Hill's teaching experiences in Baltimore, Maryland, and Brooklyn, New York provide a backdrop for her advocacy. Her research interests include multicultural education and social justice, womanist Black feminist theory, teacher preparedness for urban contexts, and science teacher education and portraiture research. Welcome, Dr. Hill. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Treva Lindsey. She is the Associate Professor at the Ohio State University. Her fields of expertise include African-American women's history, Black popular and expressive culture, Black feminism, hip-hop studies, critical race and gender theory, and sexual politics. Her first book, Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C., was a Choice 2017 Outstanding Academic title. She is a 2020-2021 ACLS Mellon Scholar and Society Fellow, and she was the inaugural Equity for Women and Girls of Color Fellow at Harvard University. Her forthcoming book, America Goddamn, Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, will be released in January 2022. She is the recipient of several awards and fellowships and writes and contributes to outlets such as Time, CNN, Al Jazeera, BET, Complex, Vox, The Root, Huffington Post, Pop Sugar, Billboard, Bustle, Teen Vogue, The Griot, The Washington Post, Women's Medical Center, Zora, and Cosmopolitan. You can find her on Twitter at Diva Feminist. Welcome, Dr. Lindsey. All right. Well, I again just want to thank you guys for joining us for this program this evening. And I think at this time we should just go ahead and jump on in. So this first question, I want to kind of open it up to everybody. Mainstream feminism has come under fire in recent years, specifically when we look at the women's marches of 2017 and 2018. Can you provide your perspective on this movement as a whole, and that has arguably been less than inclusive?
So for me, I think it begins where you orient yourself with regards to movement, because even the framing of the women's movement as something that's owned by or predominated by white women is kind of ceding territory that I don't cede with regards to women's activism. Black women, Indigenous women, women of color more broadly, have been at the forefront of women's movements, or what we would frame as women's movements, since there was a notion of how we fight for equity, how we fight for justice. Earlier, Chris mentioned Mariah Stewart, who is in public space in the 1830s, calling out sexism and racism at that intersection. You have Indigenous women who early suffragists are borrowing from to think about what egalitarian politics looks like and the rights for women. So when I think about the critiques that have emerged more recently about mainstream feminism not being inclusive, what I'm hearing is white liberal feminism as a project has not been inclusive, historically or contemporarily. But that has never stopped Black women from moving, mobilizing, organizing, demanding. You don't have Me Too without us. You don't have Black Lives Matter without us. You don't have Say Her Name without us. You don't have Black Trans Lives Matter without us. You don't have the framework of reproductive justice without us. You don't have the push to really understand gender anew without us. And so to me, it depends on where you place the center for how you understand what's happening in feminism. So for me, what's happening in feminism is always what's happening in critical race feminisms, and that we're encouraging white liberal feminists to do better than their foremothers at the suffrage march in 1913 when they relegated Black women to the back, do better than their foremothers who were kind of abolitionists, but then quickly betrayed that with their own racism in the aftermath of emancipation, who abandoned us after the 19th Amendment was passed, and largely most women of color still cannot access the ballot. And so in that moment, I see that movement, yes, needs to come under critique, but I also ask people to rethink where they center their understanding of what feminist activism is.
Treva, I'd like to push what you said a little bit, because when I read this question, I also had the same concern, right? So it's what if we reframe this idea? We center Black feminism instead, and that's exactly what you're saying. And then when we come out, who's in the margin, right? So if we center hood feminism, who's in the margin? If we center radical feminism, who is in the margin, right? Just a couple of quick points. I agree, this inclusion is not new, right? And it has made us be better, better at our activism. It's also not up to Black women. It's not our burden. We must keep moving, and we have kept moving. And to paraphrase a line in Black Panther, they'll catch up, right? They will catch up. I also want to say just a bit about movements. Movements are social, they're human, they are splintered, and they are a reflection of life. So the lack of inclusion, right, we also see that in our everyday lives.
I think the point Mickey Kendall makes about white feminists being concerned with gaining privileges as opposed to fighting for the basic necessities that all women need, like housing and food security, a safe environment to live and raise their families, is a point well made in the book. Inclusive feminisms take into account the various ways that all women are oppressed and adversely impacted. And I think what Kendall does very well in this book is demonstrate the short-sightedness of mainstream feminism over and again, especially with issues that disproportionately impact women of color and Black women in particular. One is in, evidence. One example would be reproductive health agendas that say, for example, center abortion rights above all else, right? So in Kendall's discussion of reproductive justice, she details not only her own experiences with pregnancy and miscarriages, but just lost my thought. So she details her experiences with pregnancy and miscarriage, but reproductive health for Black women is an issue of health justice, right? And human rights. Zakia Luna has a new book out that focus specifically on reproductive rights as human rights. So in Kendall's discussion, she talks about the overrepresentation of Black women, for example, with maternal mortality statistics. And she cites this alarming statistic that 234%, Black women are 234% more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women. And so the point is that, if we think more expansively, we can see the kind of narrow framework of, if you just focus on abortion, but it leaves out so much more, in other words.
Yeah, and Dr. Norwood and I have talked a little bit about hood feminism because I'm also reading it, and I also would say too, from our institution, we try to, a lot of the work we're doing is getting people to understand that when we look at these issues through marginalized people, through the lens of African American perspective, we all benefit, right? It doesn't exclude anybody from learning these things and from moving forward. So that's, I think that those are fantastic points about recentering this idea of when we talk about feminism. Mm-hmm. Dr. Lindsey, it is a fact that Black women and other marginalized women are unrepresented in the overall feminist movement. From your perspective, does being underrepresented create additional burdens and stressors for women of color, and what do these look like?
Ooh, that's a loaded one, right? So, and I think this rips off of both what Dr. Norwood and Dr. Hill are bringing to bear here as well. So, underrepresented, maybe, right? When we think about who makes it in textbooks, who makes it in terms of, profiles on television, who's called as experts to talk about certain things, sure. But underrepresented in terms of the labor of the work of doing what is done, no. I think a large number of Black women, Indigenous women, women of color are on the front lines every day in various ways fighting for various things. Dr. Norwood mentioned maternal morbidity. We're on the front lines of environmental justice, which is not somewhere you think that we are, but we absolutely understand, right? Flint is a Black feminist issue, right? Houselessness, mental health, how we think about these things are very much so rooted in that. And so the labor that I am demanding of white liberal feminists is to do better in terms of, one, thinking about these things. And as we said, recentering kind of the movement. So when we talk about equal pay, when you cite 79 cents, you're erasing the reality of equal pay as an issue, because you're erasing Latinx women who are at 54 cents on the dollar. And so how much better would our movement around pay equity be if the statistic is 54 cents? If your center is the most marginalized, as you mentioned, everybody gets freer, right? It's the Combahee thing. If Black women get free, we all get free, right? From the Combahee River Collective. And part of that impetus is saying, if people who are facing racial, gender, class, oppression, sexual oppression are faced with that, if we dismantle the systems that are doing that work, we all benefit from that kind of work. And so the labor here is not on us. We're doing the work. I think the labor is tremendously on those coming to the margins that you've created and placing those issues at the center of how we think about that. And I think Black women have been at the forefront of pushing that kind of work while also resisting being overburdened by doing that kind of work. That we are not mammies, we are not Captain Save Americas. That is not the labor that we're doing. We're showing up because our lives are at stake. The lives of our communities and our loved ones, the life of the planet is at stake. That's where the labor is. And I think it's important to recenter that as opposed to saying, hey, Black women, add this to the table of things that you need to do in order to reshift the conversation. The reshifting means the work that I think largely white feminists, white women, white folks more broadly need to do around folks of color's lives and thinking about these histories and these contemporary realities.
Thank you. Dr. Hill, so with your work on teacher preparation and the intersectional part of social justice, how, from your perspective, can educators help bridge the gap of race and gender?
So my work in education has been in teacher education, and we know that teachers, the majority of teachers are white women, right? So how do we then get them to be culturally competent? How do we get them to understand that knowledge of literacy is key, that they need to teach with an ethic of care, right? To help students not only, be successful in schools, but also be productive members of society. I think that teachers need to understand this term, racial literacy, that we need to help them become literate in terms of race, and to really just help them see their children, see the children that are in front of them. But to also admit, right, that they need this kind of education. So how do you get them to admit? You have to try to show them that if I'm not free, then they're not free either, right? And I think that goes back to what Treva was saying before. If we are all human, and we make up this collective space of humanness.
Yeah, and kind of, a follow-up to that, to the entire group, how have your respective institutions approached race and gender relations and to take these factors into account?
Well, I can start first. I'm just coming off of a Zoom meeting with Dr. Sean Harper. He was our the president's first diversity lecture. And so our institution, because of the students, right? Because the students saw a couple of years ago that, there were racial issues on campus. We have professors who also need to be racially literate. We are in the process of decolonizing our curriculum. And we have had implicit bias training. I think the idea here is that, it's not a one-stop shop, right? You don't just get it and then it's over. It's the kind of work that is consistent and ongoing, and to help my colleagues realize that not the folks who are in the work, but the folks who are not in the work, to help them realize that this is an ongoing thing, and you can't just sort of relax after one workshop. But just to answer your question, our institution is in the fold right now of trying to be more just, equitably just.
So same here. That's the, diversity and inclusion is a new buzzword around college campuses, for sure. One of the ways I see Black women and Black spaces, a space where I see Black women to be continue to be marginalized, is in women's studies programs. And this is an issue, as the only Black faculty person in the department, I have raised over and again. And I think it's a problem for a number of reasons. One, faculty persons that look like me are underrepresented, right? The curriculum needs decolonizing, right? And we are working towards that goal. But I think the problem, is that when we think about who's enrolled in terms of Black students, overwhelmingly Black college student enrollees are women or girls, young women. And women's studies programs historically and contemporarily have had trouble attracting and retaining Black female students and Black students generally. And I think a part of the problem has been this reluctance to center center anti-racism in the curriculum and make it a goal. I think as a discipline, it's a goal. In terms of the lip service, many of us give, not me personally, but programs like women's studies and give to being anti-racist. But how do we put that into practice, right? And so this continues to be a struggle. How do we move from being hopeful about being anti-racist to actually practicing anti-racism in our curriculum, in the ways that we hire, what we prioritize, et cetera.
So out of my esteemed colleagues, I'm at the largest institution, one of the largest institutions in the nation. And there are considerable efforts from the diversity and inclusion space. But I want to note for a second here, to put this into historical perspective, that this surge in this interest in hires and conversations literally came at the expense of the death of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and the great magnifier that is COVID-19 with regards to the disparate effect it's had. So 1 out of 5 people in the United States have lost someone, a loved one, broadly speaking, to COVID. It's 1 in 3 for Black people, right? And slightly even more alarming for our indigenous sibs here. And so that had to happen. We had to have the largest percentage of a population since 1947 die in a year, in a video of a Black man's life being snuffed out on camera, for us to get universities to think about doing better diversity and inclusion. And I say that to say that the efforts that we see that are emerging in this moment, I am cautiously hopeful about their sustainability beyond the moment at which we're all home and tuning in and finding ways to connect, and hoping that these efforts and this interest that we've seen arise more recently aren't explicitly about just the need for connection, but actually railing against anti-Blackness, actually railing against patriarchy, as we've seen domestic violence surge in the wake of COVID-19. And I think that that's important to put our institutions into perspective on that. So I think I can't answer that question until 2030, to be honest, to see what longitudinal ways that we're addressing a 400+ year history with regards to this. The institutions that we're in, we were never meant to be there. These were not designed for anybody on this conversation. As women, as Black women, as folks who are critiquing institutions, we are historically mapped out of these institutions. So our presence is disruptive. And then when we speak and we actually have disruptive politics, that's even farther. And so I've been afforded a department, a women's studies department. I've only been in women's studies since I've been a professor, that have been very supportive and all of that. And I haven't been the only Black woman. That's the exception in women's studies. And so I think it's important to say, I'm encouraged by the efforts and the rhetoric that everyone gets to mimic and parrot in this moment, because everyone has it, from Goldman Sachs to X university or college. But in 2030, will we see a shift? Will we see a difference? Will we see the way that we're teaching and educating and equipping people? Will we see more just outcomes? Because ultimately, that's what we're looking for, more just outcomes. Not just representation, but the outcomes of that representation matter. significantly. Mattering is beyond a number count.
And I love that you said that, highlighted the fact that we're not designed to be in these spaces. We're not expected to be in these spaces. And so the spaces themselves, right? So the spaces themselves for a lot of Black women, whether it's, women's studies or programs, or if it's in the workplace, right, tends to be quite toxic. And African Americans or Blacks, of people of color, often having to tolerate white privilege, manage white people's fears and their fragility, and then be held to the expectation of being patient, caring, and understanding. And it gets exhausting, right? So the spaces themselves are exhausting sometimes, or oftentimes.
And I think about that.
Right?
Worn out.
Worn out.
When we say women in the workplace, we say that as a newer phenomenon if we center, again, white women in the workplace. But there's not a time in history, in US history, where Black women aren't in a workplace. And so our workplace treatment as enslaved Black women matters. Our workplace treatment as then domestics in these spaces and in these schools. So, thinking about the workplace has always been this anti-Black woman space in the construct of the United States. And I think that's important to remember when we talk about women, like workplace women's issues, that the very exploitation of Black women is at the foundation of what the workplace is. And that's productively and reproductively. And so when we address workplace issues, and again, you don't put Black women at the center of that conversation, you're only going to be scratching the surface of those issues. And that's why the history matters, to understand how we get that wage disparity. Well, let's look at how we've treated Black women. Let's look at how we've treated immigrants. Let's look at how we've treated those we view as other, who are not, who work with disabilities, right? And living with disabilities, how that affects how we think about work. And that, I think, is a better center when we come back to that, from which to operate and from which to move. And I don't think our universities, for the most part, are at that center yet. I think they are like, we want you to feel better in our space. And we're saying the space is actually part of the problem here. It's a really significant part of the problem. And so there's something in this dismantling that has to happen that isn't just about putting more folks of color, queer folks, trans folks, disabled folks at the table to have them have to deal with this toxicity that exists, and the violence that can exist and harm that can exist in these spaces. Like, you got a bunch of new Black faculty, but you haven't changed any systems.
Right.
So it's not only, about decolonizing the curriculum, it's also about decolonizing your pedagogy, but decolonizing the environment, right? You have to, and so we've been having those kinds of conversations, small group of folks, but we've been having those kinds of conversations because if you say, to decolonize curriculum, how can you then bring, just like what you said, Dr. Lindsey, how can you then bring folks into this space, into this toxic space that is also, I agree, Dr. Norwood, laborious, right? We are other mothers, we are other mother professors, we are the advisors, we are the folks that students gravitate towards because we have that kind of ethic of care. So yes, completely agree in this term of toxic environment and needing to change the environment.
Thank you, guys. Dr. Norwood, it is a fact that Black women and other marginalized women are underrepresented in the overall feminist movement. But from your perspective, what specific policies and practices are being made to support women, Black women, and women of color?
Repeat it again, the last part.
So from your knowledge, what specific policies and practices are being made to support Black women and women of color?
In spaces generally?
Yeah.
What specific policies are taking place now to support Black women? Well, I mean, I see Black women carving out spaces for themselves through these movements, challenging and resisting systems of oppression that impacts them and their lives and their children's lives. Through many of the movements we've already kind of named, the RJ movement, Black Lives Matter, etc. It's a part of the burden that we have to bear, living as Black women in white racist spaces. I don't see what others are doing for us per se, but I see what we're doing for ourselves, which is what we've always done: push back, stand up, challenge, speak out, and lead ourselves and others towards a better future. I think there's always hope to work cooperatively with allies. Everybody needs help, right? And so Black women have never been opposed to that, but we're not waiting for someone else to do something for us. We're doing it for ourselves.
And to kind of just follow up on that and to throw this out to the whole group, what can allies do? I mean, a lot of things, obviously, right? Like we're a lot of things that we're not, as like I can speak for myself, that are not being done overall. So what specific things can you guys point to that you think would be beneficial?
Open the doors. Invite us into spaces where we're not seen or where we're not known. Share the stage, right? Kendall does a good job reflecting on, I can't remember the person's name that opened the door for her to be, to get into the comic book industry, right? We don't want white women thinking that they need to lead, but we don't mind you helping and assisting and opening the spaces for us to address issues that impact us. So yeah, invite us in into spaces where we are not, and then step aside.
And I would add, we don't necessarily need allies, right? We need co-conspirators, and I think Bettina Love talks about that, right? We need folks who because of the way I look, some people think I carry an agenda, right? So I feel like we need other folks to just like Dr. Norwood said, invite us into spaces, but to call things out when they see it. Call what's wrong out when you see it, right? And to be that shoulder as well.
And when we're in that space, we're not just want a seat at the table, right? A quiet seat at the table at the back, right? We want to be active participants and partners and leaders in those spaces, not ornaments that you can point to and say, look at that beautiful diversity I brought in. So yeah, invite us into the space, fully expecting us to be fully present.
Yeah, I totally agree with my esteemed colleagues. I also, in the wake of organizers and thinkers like Dr. Love, that was just invoked, the co-conspirator, and if you do use ally, please use it as a verb, not as a noun. It's an active thing. You don't get to call yourself an ally. You don't get to just be an ally. There are receipts that must be shown, and that is time and time and time again. So you are allying at various points, at various things. You can ally around reproductive health. You can ally around what's happening to Black trans women. You can ally around what's happening with poverty with regards to children. Like, these are things you ally around, and it shouldn't be easy. If it's easy, you're probably not doing it right. This is difficult work because we're asking you to come up against the very systems that afford you a level of comfort and or privilege. So if you're coming up against white supremacy and patriarchy, you're like, yo, that was an easy day, probably not doing this right. And you probably need to listen more. And then think about not just the tables that you're inviting people into, and even if you give us space and let us talk and everything, if the table is still raggedy and what you're serving at the table is still raggedy, then maybe we are building new tables together. And that you take some architectural advice from those who've experienced the weight of marginalization right? We've also experienced sexism and misogyny. We actually have recognition of some of the things you've experienced and want to bring that to bear in these new tables that emerge. So think about the active work. Don't take comfort in being an ally. Take extreme discomfort in knowing how difficult the work is, because what we're up against is so deeply entrenched.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for pointing out the co-conspirator versus allyship, because that's obviously a big thing too. And just to your point, even talking when we're in the museum and talking to people about these really tough topics, the thing we try to communicate, it's okay to be uncomfortable. You're supposed to be, these are not, warm and fuzzy topics, but it's important and it's okay. Like I think people need to stop the shutting down when the things get sticky, or like you said, if it's easy, you're probably not doing it right. So really, thank you for that. And to kind of circle back a little bit what we were talking about earlier with women, Black women specifically in spaces. Dr. Lindsey, we know that stereotypes can impact women of color, especially as it relates to roles in leadership. So from your perspective, is it enough to treat everyone the same to combat these stereotypes?
No. Short answer, no. It's not about treating everyone the same. I don't want us to throw the difference out. Like, I don't want a world in which we don't see color. I don't care who you're having intimate relationships with. I don't care what you're like, leave that aside. I want us to honor what we bring as experiences and backgrounds and histories to the table. But what that means confronting the stereotypes, the tropes, and things that are quite dangerous and harmful to Black women. So if I ever get just even a bit frustrated in a meeting, I run the risk of becoming the angry Black woman, right? One of the more well-known tropes of Black womanhood. And one, I'm pretty sure usually if I'm just lightly frustrated that I actually, whatever happened probably was severe enough for me to be angry. But I know that expression, that emotion, that there isn't a space in which that will be read in a way that affirms my humanity and affirms my experience. And so I know a lot of Black women pull into themselves when they're feeling anger. They pull in because they know what's on the other side of that. So we can't just pretend that the ways that white women experience anger and can express it versus Black women versus Latino women, Asian American women, these are all different. So we can't just look at that. We have to say when we're in these spaces, what are the stereotypes that exist and what are we going to do to unlearn these things? If we're gonna have, again, diverse rooms, then we have unlearning to do for those diverse rooms to be safe and for those diverse rooms to be just. I don't want equal treatment, I want just treatment. And just treatment to me is deeply rooted in a dismantling process of the very things that made those spaces unjust and inequitable in the first place.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hill, why do you think race and gender is so polarizing in our society?
I think it allows for separation, right? So if you separate folks, right, against humanness, right, then you will see these kinds of polarizations, just like how race is a social construction, right? It's constructed so that we can polarize people, so that we can put people in boxes. So it's a, dare I say, it's a way of controlling folks. I think I answered the question. I'm not sure. Say it again.
No, you're good. And I also recognize some of these are pretty, pretty big questions that we're throwing out here. But the concept of race and gender, why it's so polarizing. So,
yeah, I think also because in the U.S. we have these socially constructed identifiers for groups, right? And different groups are rewarded differently. They're protected differently, and they're differentially targeted, right? So I just started reading Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, what racism costs everyone and how we can prosper together. in that book, McGee lays out a thesis that in the US, there is this commitment to white supremacy. And that commitment is so strong that persons are willing to support it, even if it means that they personally lose materially or economically, or even as a nation if we lose, right? So she gives the example of a pool in Alabama where Black and white taxpayers were paid for this public pool. When Blacks demanded to use the pool, the city decided to shut it down. But they not only shut it down, they buried it. They, dig dirt and filled it with dirt and buried the pool, right? And so this commitment, or this perception that somehow if Blacks benefit, whites lose, right? So this is so deeply ingrained in this kind of American way of thinking, and people are not willing to have these, as you stated earlier, Katie, these hard conversations about race and racism, because it makes us so uncomfortable. People are not willing to acknowledge their own racism. Even just today, Prince William said, I don't know if you saw the news, where he's responding to his brother, and he says, well, we're not a racist family. Okay.
Right.
But since racism is institutionalized and ubiquitous, well, what did you do to overcome this major thing, right? And the circles that you're traveling in, how diverse are them? How diverse are those circles? What does the company look like? And how are these people in those circles socially positioned within the space? How has he or other whites who feel that they're not racist leverage their white privilege to open again spaces to persons who don't look like them? So, racism, I see it as a mental illness personally, and it's certainly a social cancer. And so to dismantle that requires deliberate, mindful, and constant effort to tend to, right? It's like, being an alcoholic. How do you work daily not to be that thing that's so deeply ingrained in us as a nation? And so that all of us are impacted by.
I think about this, the irony of someone saying our family and there's no races, as the future king of the Commonwealth, and whose wealth of empire, it's based off of colonialism, empire, and the transatlantic slave trade. But okay, but it's that notion that like racism is like I said the N-word to someone.
That's right.
Versus structural, systemic, that the fact that the wealth of the monarchy is predicated upon the oppression of people of color throughout the world. That's the reality, right, of what the institution is. But beyond that cost in bringing up Heather McGee, thank you so much, Dr. Norwood, for bringing that up. Today, a study was released from McKinsey, of all places, white firm, that said Hollywood loses $10 billion a year by not supporting Black content creators in front of and behind the camera. They're so committed to white supremacy that they have now caused themselves an annual loss of $10 billion. Because people often say it's green that matters. So if this were bankable or this were this, then Hollywood would have to. No, right? And this is an industry, we see Hollywood is always framed as this the liberal elites of Hollywood who use their platforms, and it's so diverse now. One of the most incredibly wedded to white supremacy in the ways that it unfolds, that to the tune of $10 billion a year. And I think that's just Black content creators. Imagine if we added other folks of color into that conversation regarding what that would then look like. And so I think it's so difficult because with race and gender, it's not just that race and gender is harmful, it's racism and patriarchy are hard to talk about, right? That the systems that are built upon these constructs mean that we have to interrogate power, and we have to recognize our positions within that power, and then we have to opt to do something about them or not, right? And the call to do something about them is where people are like, I have to give something up. I have to not do this or this word, or not do this and not say that. And that is where we natural, let alone when you're talking about race and gender together, right? As opposed to just a conversation about race or just a conversation about gender, because I'm sure what the loss would be if we broke that down around like Black women content creators and Black men content creators, the distinctions even within that kind of conversation. So, you know, race we get uncomfortable about because we can't talk about race without racism. Gender we get uncomfortable about because we can't talk about it without talking about sexism and patriarchy and misogyny. And so people run from the conversations, especially those who benefit most from the systems of oppression that are built around those constructs.
So I would just add, Dr. Lindsey, I appreciate this point. I would just add that if people continue to benefit, then they will always be polarized, right? They'll just keep it that way.
Absolutely. Why would you give up power, right? What do I get if I give up power? If I interrogate my privilege? What's on the other side of that for me?
Thank you, guys. I think I want to do one more question and open it up, to everybody, and then we'll go, because I know we've got one already submitted from audience. So I want to make sure and check that out. But how might we re-envision racial problems as an opportunity to work together to create the society we want and one that reflects our deepest values?
I think we should all be actively envisioning a society without racial problems, without racism, without queer phobias, without sexism. If we can imagine putting a robotic rover on Mars, like we did a couple of weeks ago, right? Finding the financial resources to build and launch this thing from Earth and send it out into space and land it perfectly as it did. I think it's well within the realm of possibility to imagine and begin to imagine a race, living in a society without racism. We can dismantle white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and poverty. We can do that. I believe that that is possible. And I believe that we need to think that that is possible. Because if we can't imagine it, then we can't achieve it. And so if we can achieve, again, this thing this robotic rover in Mars, we can imagine and we can create a society in the absence of racism and heteropatriarchy and so on and so forth. It's possible. We just got to have the will to do it.
And the collective responsibility, right? So that we can also see the humanness in all of us. But here's the thing, look what happens when we work together. We got VP Harris, we got Georgia Blue, right? We got COVID relief. So look what happens when we do work together. And if we can then highlight the light or highlight the good that happens when we work together, maybe that is also a way to operationalize, right? What we want to happen.
I love this. I love the envisioning and imagining, because what an incredible part of a Black feminist tradition of envisioning and imagining worlds otherwise, worlds that don't yet exist. Our enslaved ancestors imagined a world in which they were no longer enslaved. And many of them did not live to that point, but that didn't stop them from imagining and envisioning and doing the work that would get us there. And I think that taps into a legacy, and as you said, of what's possible when we do have real co-conspirators and when we ally and see the common good. Like, one of the things I talk about is white supremacy more recently and environmental justice, right? That literally we will lose as a planet, right? Investing in white supremacy in particular ways, because white supremacy dictates who has an abundance of resources and dictates that scarcity for those who are not in that group is fine. That's the norm, that some people will live in a scarcity and some people will have abundance. And what that's meant, that hoarding and that hoarding abundance has had immeasurable cost to the health of our planet, which means immeasurable cost to the future of human beings on this planet. And so we have to imagine and envision a world quite literally that we can inhabit that is free from white supremacy, because we won't have a world left to fight for if we don't, right? And so that imagination, whether it's the rover on Mars or the hotel that's going to open in outer space in 2027, we can imagine that, but not a basic income for people, not healthcare for people, not a sense of being able to survive, live, and thrive, right, as a matter of course here. And so I think coalescing around the idea that this is a problem that is life or death for all of us, that the stakes are enormously high, that our investment in these systems has caused irreparable harm, and patriarchy has caused irreparable, because you haven't had women at the table. You haven't had women pushing for policy and having the voice, as has the state, to bring up things, right, based on our experiences, not to be essentialist, but the range of experiences for all who identify as women or non-binary. Like, you've missed all of that. You've missed so much brilliance. So you've missed solutions because of white supremacy and patriarchy and queer phobia and ableism. You've missed it, right? You missed $10 billion in Hollywood alone. Imagine the wealth of things you've lost because we're so invested in these destructive systems that are literally killing us all right now.
Thank you. I want to, this question was submitted in prior to even this conversation, and it touches on, we've already kind of highlighted it a little bit, but the question is, what do you think are the primary underlying factors contributing to higher maternal and infant mortality rate for Black women compared to white women, even when adjusting for SES? And what steps can healthcare providers start taking to address this?
Definitely going to let Dr. Noah Wood have the bulk of this, considering their incredible work. I would just say, in my forthcoming book, I literally have a chapter called Anti-Blackness is a Pre-Existing Condition. And so we have to stop saying race is the factor, or even racism. It is decidedly, anti-Blackness is a large comorbidity with regards to outcomes for Black folks with gestational capacity. And I think it's really important to name that, and to look at the longer history of medical racism, the fact that modern gynecology itself is built off of experimentation on Black women, and what that means in terms of the medical field more broadly, the medical industrial complex more broadly, and its impact there. And so I would just say, we have to take a look. I hate to come back to it, but if we're not looking at anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism as a comorbidity, we're doing a disservice to Black people who are dying to give birth, literally dying to give birth.
That is so well said. I thought about Donna Ain Davis' Reproductive Injustice book, and she completely pinpoints anti-Black racism as the primary factor that explaining why infant mortality have been a problem for African-American women for so long. My work in Cincinnati is focused on infant mortality among African-Americans, looking from the progressive era to present. And so one of the things that is so startling about those numbers is that while, say in 1917, the infant mortality rate for Black women was like 184 point, let's say 6, I don't remember the decimal point afterward, but this high number, right, per 1,000 live births. And today in Cincinnati, we don't know the exact numbers, but we know for Hamilton County it's around 12 point something. So the numbers are falling quite drastically, right? But the gap has widened. In 1917, the gap was like 87%. Now in the 2000s, it's well over 120 some percent in terms of the disparity gap. And that's just because the infant mortality rate has improved quicker for white women than it did for African-American women. The problem is that it has been a problem for so long. And it really shouldn't have been, right? It's the same thing with tuberculosis. When the tuberculosis numbers began to decline very quickly, very early for whites by 1930s in Cincinnati, it was, not as much a problem. But for Blacks, it continued to be a problem through about the 1950s and 60s, right? And so, and those disparities widen as a result, right? Because the numbers for whites are going down, but for Blacks, it's going down, but it's remaining pretty high. And so I think you pinpointed it very well when you said anti-Black racism as a driver, right? And the reluctance really to do anything of significance to address it, right? So a lot of the IMR deaths are due to preterm births, right? So, but a lot of the policies are not addressing the conditions that are driving preterm births mortality rates, right? Which is about the stressors, that the everyday stressors that African-American women are having to deal with. And it's not just about class, right? So some of the policies that we have in Ohio specifically address low-income women. And it's the lowest of the low. And of course, that's important. You know, this is a very vulnerable group and we want to see people get access to resources, but they're not the only group. So African Americans, irrespective of social economic status, African American women, irrespective of social class, are impacted by infant mortality and maternal mortality. There was the doctor, I can't recall her name, the one that just passed away in Indiana, people were talking about. And so, yeah, I think it's a matter of neglect on some level. I mean, there's no other way you can explain it. There's no polite way of saying it other than if we cared enough, if we were more deliberate in our efforts, I think the numbers would, and the disparity in those numbers wouldn't be what they are today. It's just, you know, it just wouldn't be.
I would add that it's a lack of care for the Black body. Just a neglect, lack of care, and also a neglect for what the Black body has endured, that contributes to this health crisis.
And even the fact that I wanted to bring this up because this has been bothering me. I've been on a hunt, and I think I'm getting somewhere. I hope, fingers crossed. Not having those numbers. It's like the COVID numbers. Remember at one point very early on when they realized that there was this heightened intensity in terms of disparity for African Americans and Latinx populations, all of a sudden we couldn't get our hands on the numbers. The Chicago mayor was releasing numbers that states weren't releasing, the CDC weren't providing this information. Well, I can't get this information for Cincinnati City. I've been struggling to get it. The numbers exist for Hamilton County. You can go and look, if you Google it right now, you'll find a bunch of numbers for Hamilton County, but you will not find numbers for the city. Well, the numbers are more concentrated in Cincinnati and Hamilton County, right? And so they will tell a slightly different story than when we are looking by county. And so having access to those numbers and that data gives us a way of monitoring exactly what's happening and what progress is being made and what progress is being stalled.
Thank you, guys. And then I've got, I think this one's good. Since this movement is so multifaceted and will inevitably take decades to change, where do you think the best place or most important place for change to occur is? And how do we allow others to help us while I can't say this word. Different between
a word like this.
It has been such a long day between the people speaking out as performative activists versus those who are legit.
So I tend not to want to rank because the issues are overlapping, right? I mean, I think the dismantling of white supremacy does a lot in terms of addressing quite a bit. Dismantling patriarchy does a lot in terms of doing that. So how do we go about that? I tell people, when you're organizing, when you're thinking about your time, like my expertise is as a historian, right? I chronicle, I document, I engage with folks. That's a skill set that I can use in service of a broader vision and imagination for what the world can be. And so some of this is saying we need people fighting on all of the fronts. It's not, I think we have to have a big picture of what that means. So for me, the dismantling of oppressive systems, which are interlocking, means I might not be on the front lines all the time in food apartheid systems, but I know that that's essential to understanding what it means to dismantle white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and transphobia, right? And undoing that, I'm actually supporting movements around food apartheid, food deserts, and houselessness and mental health. And so I think the umbrella challenge is recognizing these interlocking systems that produce all of these different kinds of inequities, right? So the manifestation of maternal morbidity for Black folks with gestational capacity is absolutely about racism, misogynoir, anti-Blackness, capitalism, right? They're all meshed in there together. So if you're addressing that, you have to work to dismantle those things, which in turn means you're working to dismantle environmental injustice, which in turn means you're fighting to think about houselessness and the global considerations of what this means, of the global implications of what we're doing. And so for me, it's really hard to tease out, this is the thing you should do versus what is the propelling force behind the kinds of mobilizing and organizing that you do, right? What are you trying to upend ultimately? Because you can't end gun violence without addressing poverty, right? You can't do it. And you can't address poverty without what? Addressing white supremacy and without addressing patriarchy. It's not possible. And so in that way, I think you find out who someone said legit and performative. Performative can take the moment of 2020 and make a lot of statements, can make a lot of gestures, can make a lot of moments. I think legit is those folks who are really bringing together these various movements and understanding how these overarching interlocking forces are unfolding. Because there's nothing performative you can really do with that. That's grunt work. That's like in the trenches, laborious work, whether that's in an archive, writing, mobilizing, door to door, digital actor. I mean, there's so many places where that happens, but it's sustainability, right? So thinking about how you make the distinction between the two is, I think, what's the greater vision? What is the narrative around what's propelling this person, these persons to act and to move? And do they see the problems clearly and is interconnected?
It's always about the both and. It's never the either or, right? So it's how can we do this and do this at the same time? The other thing is that this work doesn't end. It is ongoing work. So we can't focus on one thing and end it and then say, okay, now we're going to focus on the other. And that's because of what Dr. Lindsey just said, that it's layered, it's intersectional, right? And getting rid of one thing won't necessarily get rid of another, but it'll help to get rid of the other, right? I also need to add this other piece. Think about everyday activism. Don't think about things that are so big. Think about what you can do in your community that you can do on an everyday basis, right? Maybe somebody doesn't have food and is right outside of the grocery store and you can buy food for them, right? Buy a bag of groceries. So and maybe it's connecting with other groups of people so that you can then, help end period poverty. So how can you do sort of small acts of activism in your everyday life?
Stand up and speak out when you see it happening in front of you, whether it's happening to you or happening to someone around you. If it means writing a letter, an email, writing something for the newspaper, call attention to it. It's important to put a light on injustice and not let it pass. But that requires courage. and a willfulness to be bold. Yeah, bring attention to it. That's really, really important. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there. But yeah, call it out.
Thank you. Thank you so much, you guys, for this conversation. I've immensely enjoyed it. I think everybody has. We've got a lot of thank yous, and you guys rock and everything else in the chats. And this will be available to rewatch. We will post it sometime on our website next week. And everybody, if anybody's interested in future programmings, please check our website at freedomcenter.org and to donate there so we can continue having great programs like this and having these really good conversations. And we also posted in the chat a survey link to tonight's program if anybody is interested in filling that out. So again, thank you guys so much for taking this time and being with us tonight, and hope everybody has a good one.